I'm Jessica Lemon of AARP Texas, and I am pleased that AARP is a proud sponsor of the Striking a Balance Caregiver Conference. As a sponsor, we hope that you're gaining new insights into family caregiving and that you have the opportunity to connect with other caregivers and experts on aging. Family caregiving is a priority for AARP. It is essential to our work today, but that's not all. AARP is doing amazing things to make life better for the age 50 plus populations and the generations to follow. We help improve their financial well-being and their health. We want people to contribute to society and local communities and to fully enjoy life. Some of you may already know that AARP has a strong presence throughout Texas in many communities in this great state, including Austin, the capital city where I live and work. Again, this year, AARP Texas is bringing opportunities to our members and others through virtual events, just like this one that we're participating in today. We hope you have the opportunity to enjoy these free offerings. Not only are there programs to help unpaid family caregivers, but there are presentations to help people avoid being victims of fraud. We host fitness seminars and we work with city leaders towards making this an even more age-friendly community. And know this, volunteers are critical for our mission. There are many opportunities for those who can give a little time to volunteer. You can learn more about these local happenings at aarp.org/tx or find us at the AARP Texas Facebook page. But again, of course, family caregiving is a priority. There are 48 million family caregivers in the US, 3.4 million in Texas alone. They provide help to loved ones, usually a parent, spouse, or sibling. Caregiving can be anything from driving a loved one to a doctor's appointment, making sure bills are paid, cleaning the house, or helping bathe and dress, and many caregivers do fairly complex medical tasks. Caregivers come from every generation, from Gen Z to the silent generation, and every racial and ethnic group. And you know, most of us will either be a caregiver or need care at some point during our lives. AARP recently released new research on how much family caregivers spend out of their own pockets to care for a loved one. We found that almost every caregiver spends money on caregiving, and about 8 in 10 routinely spend their own money on caregiving. The average amount that caregivers spend each year is $7,240. That's more than a fourth of their household income on average. Housing expenses like rent or mortgage payments, assisted living, and home modifications make up more than half of caregiver spending, followed by medical expenses. Caregivers also experience indirect financial setbacks, often postponing their own personal savings for retirement. But I am here to tell you there's action that can help. Congress is considering a bipartisan bill called the Credit for Caring Act, which would create a tax credit of up to $5,000 for working family caregivers. This could help offset some of those major expenses that we know caregivers are facing. AARP, along with 80 other organizations, endorse the Credit for Caring Act. Family caregivers are the backbone of our long-term care system, but they are breaking under the pressure. Creating a tax credit for family caregivers is one way that Congress can help. If you would like to learn more about the Credit for Caring Act, visit aarp.org/caregiving. There, you will also find many resources available for family caregivers just like you. So again, that's aarp.org/caregiving. Thank you for listening. Again, I'm Jessica Lemon with AARP Texas, and thank you for all that you do as family caregivers or to support caregivers.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon. My name is Rob Fabian with Age of Central Texas, and along with our partners at the Area Agency on Aging of the Capital Area, we are very excited to bring you our second day of the 20th anniversary Striking a Balance Caregiver Conference. This is the longest running and largest caregiver conference here in Central Texas, and we're very excited to have another wonderful presentation for you today. Before we get started, we've got just a few little housekeeping items I want to go over with you. Number one, we are recording this session. So if for any reason you need to leave early or you have technical issues on your side and you're not able to complete watching it today, don't worry. We're recording it. We're going to be uploading the recording to YouTube. And later this week, we are going to send you the link to that recording along with the slides from today's presentation. In fact, we're going to send you the links and the slides and everything from all the presentations for this entire week. Number two, we sent you a copy of the program for this year's conference. We hope you take a look at that because it has wonderful information in it, not only about all of our great speakers, but also we curated some wonderful caregiver resources just for you. So we hope you take a look at that. Now, down here below on your screen, you have a chat feature. It looks like one of those thought bubbles that you see in the comic strips. We want you to click on that, and during today's session, we want to hear from you. We want this to be interactive. So ask your questions, make your comments, because again, this is for you, the caregiver. This is why we have been doing this for 20 years, is bringing you some of the best experts from across the nation on caregiving issues. So this is your chance to ask all of those questions about where you are in your journey and have them answered by Michael, who is one of the great experts in long-term care planning and long-term care options here in the area. Finally, we're going to send you a survey at the end of the week, and we hope that you'll take just a couple of minutes. That's all it'll take, 2 minutes, to just fill out that survey online. And it's going to help us to plan for next year's conference. You see, all of the speakers that we have featured this week came from your suggestions from our previous conference. And so we want to make sure that we are bringing you all the speakers that can help you where you are in your caregiving journey. So share that with us in the survey. Let us know what are some of the topics that would be most helpful for you, and we'll find those speakers for next year. All right, it is my pleasure to welcome back Michael Gill. He is one of the leading experts here in Central Texas when it comes to long-term care. He's the president of Texas Senior Living Locators, which works with families to help them find the best senior housing options here in the Central Texas area. Michael actually started his career in finance and business. He worked in banking and worked on Wall Street. In fact, he authored 2 books on finance. And then in 2012, he pivoted his career when he founded the Texas Senior Living Locators. And they are an amazing company that helps people with Michael's extensive knowledge in veterans benefits, home health care, non-medical home care, geriatric care management, long-term care insurance, senior real estate specialists, senior movers, and just a myriad of other services to help you in your journey with your loved one. Michael is widely considered one of the top experts when it comes to senior housing options and senior long-term care. So Michael, we are so glad that you're back with us again today so that we can talk about the ins and outs of long-term care. We know that things have changed in the long-term care community in the past decade. A lot of new services and services have changed, and things have just changed overall with COVID. So we're so glad that you're here to help walk us through as caregivers what we need to know about long-term care. I'm going to turn it over to you. Be sure, folks, ask your questions, and then we'll answer them at the end of the session. Michael, it's all yours.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate that introduction. You're very kind. I'm going to share a slideshow presentation on the screen. So bear with me a minute because the technology is always a little bit funny. So let me pull that up first. There we go. So today's presentation is titled The Ins and Outs of Long-Term Care in Austin. What I'm going to do today is go through basically what happens when you're at home with long-term care, and then what happens when you need to move, because there's a couple of different types of long-term care. And we always talk generically about nursing homes. And people use nursing homes as a generic term for any type of senior living, and that's not true. The senior living industry has been segmented over the last 20 years into about 4 different levels, maybe even 5, depending on how you define them. So we'll go over each one of those. And then at the end, we're also going to talk a little bit about what happened over the last year and a half with COVID, and where we're looking like we're going with COVID, in the next 6 months or so in the long-term care industry. So let's get started. So what happens when somebody gets old? Where do they usually live? Usually people live at home, whether that's an apartment or a single family detached dwelling in a normal residential neighborhood. And there's a lot of support services that are available for people who are living at home. The first thing to know is that there's private caregivers. Private caregivers include personal assistance services agencies, like something Visiting Angels or a Home Instead, Home Away, Halcyon Home. There's a lot of different names for them. But these are companies that provide caregivers that will come into the house. Just so people understand how those usually work, usually when they're sending somebody to your house, the agency will send somebody for a 4-hour minimum. That's because it's hard for them to make money sending somebody for just an hour here and an hour there when there's so much travel distance and friction to deal with. So they usually want a 4-hour minimum. The cost for these services runs anywhere these days between $25 and $30 an hour. So to have somebody come into your house is about $100 to $120 per day. So it's not cheap. The services that these people offer are light housekeeping, meal preparation, laundry, standby shower assistance. They can help some with medication management, most of the activities of daily living. The second thing the second service that comes into anybody's house is the home health care. Home health care is paid for by Medicare. Home health care includes physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, and some nursing services. And I say that it's paid for by Medicare. You can hire some of these things privately, but over 90% of the revenues of any home health care agency comes from Medicare. Hospice will also come in to the house. Hospice is also 100% paid for by Medicare. One thing you do need to understand is that hospice and home health are both paid for by Medicare, but Medicare will only pay for one or the other. So the only downside to going on hospice is that you can't get physical therapy and those types of services when you are on hospice. The last type of help that you can get from an outside agency that comes into the house is from geriatric care managers. Geriatric care managers are an agency that's usually comprised of social workers and nurses who can basically be a daughter for hire. So the way the classic way that people use them is, say somebody's got a child living in New York, and the New York child can't visit their parents here in Austin enough. So they will hire a geriatric caregiving service company, and the geriatric care managers will actually pick up the seniors and take them to doctor's offices. We'll write a report to the child afterwards about what's going on. If there's additional services that need to be put in place, such as from personal assistance services agency, they will hire them. So they'll do most of the stuff that a child would do if they were in town. But this way you can have a professional doing it for you when you're working from out of town. These agencies usually charge between $125 and $150 per hour. So they're not cheap either, but it's a great service. So one of the first questions I want to address is, when do you move from the house? First off, you got to understand it's an incredibly personal decision where you want to live and how you want to live your life. I have sort of 3 rules though when you do have to move. The first rule when you have to move is when somebody's a danger to themselves. Now, this could be because they're mistaking their medications. For example, it's not uncommon that I get calls from people in the hospital saying that their parent has taken their medications 5 times in a row because they forgot they took them already. And so they overdosed unintentionally. Another reason they could be dangerous is they're leaving the stove on, or they could be wandering outside and not being able to find their way home. These are obvious cases where somebody's a danger to themselves and they need to, they're no longer safe living at home. Second reason why somebody will move is when there's self-neglect. This is similar to being a danger to yourself, but this is not as serious. Usually this is an individual who simply isn't eating as much, isn't taking their medications because of apathy, because they're getting a little bit depressed by living alone, and when they're just not quite taking care of themselves. So when they'd be safer someplace else, they also have to move. And that's different than when they're a danger to themselves. The third reason somebody absolutely has to move is when there are caregiver issues. This could be the case of an 85-year-old woman who is taking care of their 90-year-old husband, and she's now getting old enough and frail enough that she can no longer care for him adequately. Or it could be the case of some adult children who are working and leaving their parent at home when they're working, and they're no longer quite safe or no longer getting the adequate care at home when the kids are at work. Or if you live in a rural area and a caregiver simply can't get there, and if the caregiver is not getting there, then it could be catastrophic in certain cases. So these are times when you have to absolutely move. There are times when you move, though, when you're not absolutely required to. The main reason that people move when they're not required to is because they're tired of taking care of the house, and they're tired of of cooking for themselves, or when they're not getting enough socialization. Those are the primary three reasons that people move earlier. So there's different levels of care where you can move. I'm going to start from the lowest level of care and sort of work my way upwards. So I'm going to start with independent living communities. I'm then going to talk about assisted living communities. Memory care is the third one I'll talk about, and I'll talk about skilled nursing last. So the first one we want to talk about is independent living communities. Now, what is an independent living community? An independent living community is an apartment building surrounding a centralized dining room with a meal plan. They also have transportation services to and from doctor's offices. Usually they'll go a couple times a week to Walmart and Walgreens and HEB as well on their transportation services. And then they also include activities. The activities usually include bridge and bingo and things like that, but also arts and crafts. Sometimes they include lunch outings to different places. And so the idea is that there's a greater focus on the social side of the equation when you're an independent living community. Now, an independent living community is not licensed to hire caregivers. That's what an assisted living is. However, there are still a lot of support services in an independent living building. Remember when I talked on the second slide about personal assistant service agencies? Those are the ones that charge $100 to $120 a day for a 4-hour a day minimum. Well, usually what happens is an independent living community will go ahead and rent an apartment or an office to a personal assistant services agency. And that agency will take care of people who are in the building. But rather than charging a 4-hour minimum, because the caregivers that they hire, and they're going to end up having 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different caregivers in the building at any one time, the caregivers are just going between room 201 and helping Mrs. Jones, for example, with medication management. Then they're going to 207 and helping Mrs. Smith with some laundry, and going to room 210 and helping them with some standby shower assistance or something. And because they're able to just go without much friction from apartment to apartment to apartment, what they're able to do is charge by the task. Now, every different independent living community has a different pricing structure for the outside caregiving agency that provides the help. So some of the outside caregiving agencies may provide it by the activity. So for example, a load of laundry might be $10 per load, or every time they do a medication pass, it might be, say $7.50 per medication pass. Other places will charge on an hourly or half hour or a 15-minute basis. So if you can do a load of laundry in 15 minutes plus do medication management, and so they'll throw in a load of laundry at the same time, maybe they give you a little bit of a break on that. Sometimes if somebody needs 3 different medication passes throughout the day, they'll charge, say, $12.50 for that, whereas one pass may be only $7.50. My point is that A, it's cheaper when you're in an independent living community to get help from one of these outside caregiving agencies. And B, everybody's got a little bit of a different way of pricing it. And so whenever we're visiting a place, an independent living community, you have to try and figure out how they're doing things and what their prices are going to be. Then when you get there, you're going to have to try and imagine, okay, well, what would my parent need in terms of extra support? And then you have to add that into the price. Independent living communities are all private pay. And I'll tell you about the cheapest independent living community is about $2,000 a month. What that includes is an apartment, usually a studio. That includes 3 meals a day. That includes the transportation services, and it also includes the activities schedule. Now, that's the cheapest in town, and that's usually a studio. A 1-bedroom apartment, usually it's hard to find something under about $2,500 a month. The median price for a 1-bedroom apartment would be $3,000 to $3,500. And a 2-bedroom apartment is usually about $3,500 to $4,500. Having said that, if I try and spend as much money as possible, I can spend $7,000 on a 2-bedroom apartment. And if I want to include a view and a balcony, that might go up to $8,000 or $9,000. But generally, a 1-bedroom apartment is $2,500 to $3,500. A 2-bedroom apartment is $3,500 to $4,500. A studio is under $3,000, and of course, it varies from there. So on top of that, remember that if you're using the outside caregiving agency, that's an extra service. Also, one thing I do want to mention is that all independent living, assisted living, and memory care communities charge what's known as a community fee. That's a move-in fee that is almost never refundable. The average price for that is about $2,500. So when you move into a community, you have to pay the $2,500 community fee, and then you have to pay 1 month's rent up front, whatever that is. And that's true for independent living, assisted living, and memory care. So that's the main thing that goes on in independent living. By the way, independent living can look like assisted living light with all the help from the outside caregiving agency. And there are many people in independent living, not many, but there's a fair amount that go all the way through hospice. If you throw enough money at the problem of outside caregivers, you can live in independent living through end of life. There are some independent living communities that really don't want to have people who are too high need in the independent living community. The reason that they're doing that is they're not trying to be mean or anything, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to maintain sort of the independence of their community, trying to maintain a community feel that has high level of abilities. And that's so that they're attracting other people with high levels of abilities as well. But generally, most communities want to keep heads in beds to try and keep their occupancy up as much. So most places will keep people for a very long time. The next level of care up is assisted living. An assisted living community, like an independent living, is an apartment building surrounding a centralized dining room with a meal plan. The main difference, though, is they are able to hire caregivers. And the caregivers are the ones, the caregivers from the building are the ones that help people with the activities of daily living. And activities of daily living is something I want to discuss here briefly, because this is a term that is an industry term. There are 7 activities of daily living: dressing, bathing, eating, transferring, toileting, incontinence, and medication management. The first 6 are considered official activities of daily living, because for long-term care insurance or for veterans benefits, you need to require 2 out of the 6 activities of daily living to qualify for those benefits. Medication management is not considered an activity of daily living, but it's probably the #1 extra activity of daily living that's offered to most people in assisted living and in independent living. But why it's not considered an official activity of daily living, I don't really know. At any rate, assisted living communities, because they're focused on activities of daily living, you'll notice that these are non-skilled services. There's nothing here that pierces the skin. There are no ventilators, feeding tubes, tracheotomies. Those are all things that are reserved for skilled nursing. Therefore, an assisted living community is considered custodial care. It's not considered medical necessity. Medical necessity is when we go to skilled nursing, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, there are a few things that we should know about assisted living communities because there's some differences among them. First off, there are large assisted living and small assisted living. So in Texas, if some place is being hired out to provide activities of daily living, and they have 4 or more people living there that are unrelated, then it has to be licensed as an assisted living. From 4 beds up to 16, that's considered a small assisted living. A small assisted living does not have to have a nurse on site 40 hours a week. It does not have to have a dedicated activities director. Once you get over 17 beds, you have to have the dedicated activities director, and you also have to have the nurse on site 40 hours a week or more. The other thing to recognize is that a large assisted living has some special architectural features that the small assisted livings don't. And it's mostly just industrial strength, this, that, or the other thing. Most of the time, you're not going to notice it, but there are extra things that they're required to have. The reason I mention this is that, or one of the reasons I mention this is that you'll see a lot of 16-bed assisted livings because they don't want to go to the next level because their costs go up significantly. Sometimes there'll even be 2 16-bed facilities side by side. So it's a 32-bed facility, but they have 2 different licenses. So now you know why they stop at 16 beds. There are also small assisted livings called personal care homes. A personal care home is usually a single family detached house in a normal neighborhood where they've enclosed the garage or they've enclosed the formal living room and the formal dining room, and they've made more bedrooms that way. And then they've renovated the bathroom. And so they've taken what would normally have been a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house, and they've turned it into a small assisted living that might have 7 bedrooms and room for anywhere from 9 to 11 people. And then they usually have 2 caregivers during the day and at least 1 overnight. And those small personal care homes are often better for people because they're so small. They're better for fragile people because they're so small that there's always somebody in just the next room, and the caregivers know what everybody's doing in their room at all times. The downside of personal care homes is that the activities are not as good. The intellectual stimulation is not as good. The upside, as I say, is that they're much better at taking care of particularly fragile individuals. Now, there's one other type of nuance that you need to know about assisted living regulation, and that's the fact that there are type A and type B assisted living. The type A assisted living, everybody has to have enough, everybody has to be able to self-evacuate within 13 minutes. So in a type A assisted living, nobody who's in a wheelchair basically can go to a type A assisted living in general because they cannot self-evacuate within 13 minutes. A type B assisted living, they have to have enough staff to be able to evacuate with everybody within 13 minutes. So frequently type B assisted livings are on one floor, for example, so that they don't have to move people downstairs and things like that. Not always the case, but that's always something to keep in mind. Because if you're in a type A assisted living and then say you fell and broke your hip and now you're no longer able to self-evacuate within 13 minutes, in theory, the type A assisted living is supposed to ask you to move out to another building. I always try and keep people from moving twice. So sometimes type A assisted livings that's a consideration that I want my clients to keep in mind. As I said earlier, assisted living communities are prohibited by regulation from accepting certain types of residents or residents who need certain types of care. One of the most important ones to recognize is that if somebody is bedbound, they're not supposed to be able to go into an assisted living as a new resident. Okay, so what that means is, in general, they'll say if somebody can stumble through the door, they can go into an assisted living. If unfortunately they're not able to help with their transfer, if they cannot support their weight enough to be helped up into a standing position, pivot 90 degrees, and then sit on down into a wheelchair, if they can't do that as a minimum, in general, they're supposed to go to a skilled nursing instead of an assisted living. So that's one reason I tell people not to wait too long to put their parents into assisted living, is because if they decline too far of a level, potentially they'll have to go to skilled nursing instead, and there won't be an option. Now, there's a little bit of gray area there and stuff, but that's something that I really want to emphasize is important. Now, what does assisted living cost? Well, number one, it's all private pay. I get calls all the time asking, will Medicare pay for anything in assisted living? Medicare will pay for only skilled nursing. Medicaid used to have some programs that would pay for assisted living in Austin, but what it comes on down to is Medicaid will pay so little that nobody can make enough money on Medicaid. So nobody in Hayes, Travis, or Williamson County offers any assisted living on Medicaid. If you want Medicaid, you have to go to a skilled nursing, and we'll get to that. So it's all private pay. Now, what's the cost for assisted living? Nationwide, assisted living costs about $4,000 a month is what the surveys have said. In Austin, a studio apartment will generally run around $3,300 to $4,000. A one-bedroom apartment will usually run $3,800 to $5,800 a month. And a two-bedroom apartment they're pretty rare in two-bedroom apartments, quite frankly. So, but they generally are more than $6,000 a month for a two-bedroom apartment and up. But in assisted living, they're rare. On top of this, what you have to understand is that assisted living charges levels of care. So the base prices that I just gave you are all for just 4 walls, some carpet, and the meals. If you need extra services cost extra. Everybody has a different scheme for how they charge extra services. Most places charge extra by charging for level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and sometimes level 5. And the way they figure out which level you are in varies from community to community. A lot of times they do it by points. So level 1 may be up to 50 points, level 2 may be up to 100 points, etc. And medication management may be 30 points, and then standby shower assistance may be 25 points, and then escort services to and from the dining room might be an extra 25 points. At that point, you may get up to level 2 or even level 3, depending on how they do things. Some of the bigger things that cause people to go up the higher level of care is usually incontinence and mobility issues. So if somebody needs to be helped to the bathroom, that's usually a fairly high level of care. If somebody is a two-person transfer, a high level of care. If somebody is incontinent, and usually that's level 4 or 5. Each level is usually $300 to $400, sometimes $500 extra. So if you were paying for a one-bedroom apartment $4,800 and you had level 2, that would be maybe an extra $800, and so you go from $4,800 to $5,600 for that apartment. Most places will cap the services at around $2,000. So if you go in at $4,800 for your base price, $6,800 is usually as much as they'll charge you. Occasionally, places will add an extended level of care charge on top of that $2,000. So part of what you want to take away from this is that, number one, there's a base price. Number two, there is an extra price for levels of care that can go up to $2,000 and sometimes more. And that number three, every different community is different in how they assess these charges. And the way that you, when you go in and talk to the admissions person and say, this is what my mother has going on, usually he or she will go ahead and say, well, gee, that sounds like it'd be level 1 or 2 or 3, but we're going to have my nurse go out and do an assessment. The admissions people are not allowed to do the pricing. It's only the nurse that can do the assessment, because they know that's who actually ends up having to deal with the potential resident. And so the admissions people will sometimes give a good faith estimate, but understand it always comes back down to the question of what the nurse is going to say. So that's assisted living. The next level of care I want to talk about is memory care. Before I get there, I want to talk about the issue of what goes on with people with this. I'm sorry, what I'm trying to say is, one of the only objective measures we have for quality of care is how many caregivers there are. okay? A lot of what I do is I help people try and figure out which place is best for their parent. A lot of it comes down to, who's got the best socialization and things like that. But when it comes down to care, often the only objective measure we have is how many caregivers are there in a building, and how many residents is each caregiver taking care of. In an assisted living community, each caregiver is going to take care of between 12 and 14 residents in general as guidance. In more expensive places may have more caregivers, less expensive places may have less caregivers. But in assisted living, 12 to 14 to 1 is about right. One of the reasons that you go from assisted living to memory care is because memory care has more caregivers per resident. Usually there's only 8 residents per caregiver in a memory care. So now that we're talking about memory care, that's what I want you to understand is there's a couple of reasons to go to memory care. And what is the difference between assisted living and memory care? Memory care is actually an assisted living license, but it has a second certification. And that second memory care certification basically requires the community to have a lock on the front door, and it requires them to have more caregivers. Because as you can imagine, somebody with memory care issues requires more help than somebody in an assisted living as a general rule. So memory care has 8 caregivers more or less or 8 residents per caregiver. So they have a much higher level of care. Memory care communities are always a type B assisted living license because it's assumed that nobody can self-evacuate from a memory care facility. They're always secure, as I say. It has a lock on the front door. We don't call these lockdown facilities. One of the euphemisms we use is that these are secure facilities because they're really secure only for the resident's safety. Because a memory care resident, there are a couple of type of people who will leave the building and won't be safe if they do. There are wanderers who would, go on out and see some flowers they wanted to go look at, and then they see a dog down the street they want to go pet, and before you know it, they wouldn't know where they are or how to get back home. So a wanderer is there because they'd be insecure in an assisted living community. There's also people who are what we call exit seekers, and exit seekers have some sort of compulsion to leave. Now, it could be because they don't like where they are, but more often it's because they think, oh, gee, the kids are coming home from school. I got to get home before the kids get there. Or my mother must be missing me. I need to get home to my mother. And of course, this is an 85-year-old person who, whose parent has been dead for a long time, but in their mind, they're still a child. So exit seekers are often trying to figure out how to get out of that front door. And so that's why 100% of memory care are always secure. Now, one of the things that goes on with memory care also is that not only do they have a better caregiver to resident ratio, but they generally have a better staff training. Because what they say, for example, is every hour is a different day in memory care. There's a lot of different memory dementia behaviors. Number one, more people are incontinent, so they have to take everybody to the bathroom every 2 hours. Number two, they're going to have to be redirected sometimes. As I said, somebody will walk up to you and say, gee, can you help me find my mother? Well, of course you can't help her find her mother. Her mother's dead. But you don't want to tell her your mother's dead because that's going to traumatize her. So what you say is, well, let's go look for your mother. And oh, look, it's time for lunch. Let's look for your mother after lunch. And you're trying to redirect her or just distract her from what her thoughts are so as to be kind to her and not trying to, make them think that, or, well, give them any reasons for anxiety. Now, memory care is priced different at most places than assisted living. Somewhere around 70 or 80% of memory care communities are all inclusive, okay? And because they're all inclusive, they cost more than assisted living. As I said, assisted living is a base price plus extra for levels of care. Well, it's really hard to do cost accounting on a memory care community because people change day in and day out, and they have good days and bad days. So a lot of the places do all-inclusive pricing. Sometimes all-inclusive pricing doesn't include incontinence supplies. Sometimes there's an extra charge for incontinence supplies. Sometimes there's an extra charge for extended care. When somebody's towards the end of life as a 2-person transfer, they may be bedbound. or something like that. But so the point is that memory care is usually more expensive. There are many memory care communities that do charge a base price plus extra levels of care. So again, one thing to emphasize is every place is a little bit different, and it's hard to figure out how much it's going to charge until you get there. Most memory cares are attached to an assisted living. In more recent years, there's been a lot more memory cares that are freestanding. As a general rule, I prefer the freestanding memory cares because they're more expert at what they do, and they don't have to go between assisted living and memory care. They don't share the workers as much, and they specialize in just one thing. But there's some very good reasons to move to an assisted living that has a memory care attached, because it's nice to have an easy transition process to when your parent needs to go that direction. Again, memory care is 100% private pay, just like assisted living, just like independent living. Now, the next level of care above assisted living and memory care is skilled nursing. Now, the primary thing you have to recognize about skilled nursing is that somewhere around 75 to 80% of all the residents in a skilled nursing are there because either Medicare or Medicaid is paying for it. Okay, so Medicaid pays for about 58% of skilled nursing residents nationwide. That may, if you look at a skilled nursing here in town, some places have almost all Medicaid residents. Other places don't accept any Medicaid residents, but 58% is the average nationwide. These are the least profitable residents for any skilled nursing because Medicaid reimburses the least. So what most skilled nursings try and do is they try and get the most profitable residents, which are short-term rehab residents, which are paid for by Medicare. Those residents are usually only there for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. They're coming out of the hospital and they with a broken hip or with pneumonia or urinary tract infection. Those are probably the top 3 reasons that people go to a skilled nursing and on Medicare, excuse me. And because they're getting rehab, skilled nursing receives about $600 a day for one of those residents. A private pay resident is the second most profitable. Here in Austin, a private pay resident would pay about $150, $180 per day, or about $5,400 a month for a shared room. And that might be somewhere between $7,500 and $9,000 per month in a private room. The most expensive private pay skilled nursing in town actually charges $500 a day, or about $15,000 a month. But the average, as I say, is just somewhere around $5,400 a month. Now, when you go to a skilled nursing home on Medicaid, there are 2 criteria. Number 1 is financial, and number 2 is medical. On the financial side, I'm not going to go into it too much, but for an individual, you can't be making more than about $2,375 a day, and you can't have more than $2,000 of assets. On the medical side, there is medical necessity. Most of the time, medical necessity comes down to dementia. I would bet that's 80% of the time or more, but there are other things that can give medical necessity. I'll tell you that I have seen people in a wheelchair with multiple sclerosis who don't qualify for medical necessity because they're too healthy. So I'm always hesitant to try and characterize medical necessity in too great detail because it depends. But the main takeaway I want you to take away from this is that dementia is the primary reason that people qualify in nursing homes. Now, nursing homes also serve long-term residents with complex medical cases. So what that means is where I talked about earlier, that's ventilators, feeding tubes, tracheotomies, IV drips, or maybe they have severe dementia and they have some complicating factors such as COPD and they're on oxygen and they have to have a colostomy bag and some other things. So often that there's a couple of cases that are just way too severe for an assisted living. Many of the people I will tell you that are in a skilled nursing, I think could get better care in an assisted living, but often the family thinks that they're such difficult cases that they automatically have to go to skilled nursing, and they never quite investigate the capabilities of assisted living. So I would say that if you're paying privately, don't automatically assume you have to go to skilled nursing. There's an awful lot that we can do in assisted living or in a small personal care home or in a memory care that would mean that they don't have to go to skilled nursing. People often ask me about continuing care retirement communities or CCRCs. So what is the CCRC? I'm not going to go spend too much time on this, but people hear about it, and so I want to just sort of discuss it. The CCRC is a place where they have all 4 different levels of care on the same campus, meaning independent living, assisted living, memory care, and skilled nursing all on the same campus. So in Austin, we only have 5 places that qualify as a CCRC. 3 of them, Westminster, Carencia, and Longhorn Village, are buy-in places, and 2 of them, Buckner Villa and Wesleyan, are not buy-in, and so they're a little bit different. But Westminster, Carencia, and Longhorn Village, you may have to spend up to $1.2 million to buy into the place. That's for $1.2 million is going to be for the largest 2-bedroom apartment in the newest part of the building at Westminster, maybe. Or at Carencia, that's what it would cost to go into a cottage. At Buckner Villas and Wesleyan, they don't have any buy-in fees except for their cottages, and that's really just a very small percentage. And they do have all 4 levels on the same campus. There are many places that are near CCRCs where they have, say, 3 of them of the 4 on the same campus. Brookdale Westlake, Brookdale Lakeway, for example, both have skilled nursing and assisted living. Brookdale Lakeway has memory care. Brookdale Westlake has assisted living. I'm sorry, both those Brookdales have skilled nursing. So they're near CCRCs. One of the trends in the industry is that there are more places being built that are more integrated. So for example, the Enclave at Cedar Park has independent living, assisted living, and memory care. And that's true of, say, the Village of the Triangle. That's true of Maravilla at the Domain and a couple of other places. But the main takeaway from the CCRCs you probably want to know about is that most of them have a large buy-in. But there's 2 of them here in town that are nonprofits, Bucknerville and Wesleyan, that do not. Just a quick comment. There are a lot of different options. There's, here on this slide, I have 234, but it's probably closer to 250 now. Different options of where you can go for long-term care in town. Skilled nursing's, they average about 111 beds per skilled nursing. Assisted living is smaller. The large assisted livings are about 78. Memory care averages about probably closer to 28 to 30 people in their memory cares these days. There's another level of care that I didn't talk about, which is called independent living. And independent living is basically just an apartment complex that has an age restriction. The 55 plus is it has the age restriction. 55 plus does not include any meals, but nobody under 55 can move in. There's a couple of places that have that are 60 plus or 62 plus, but generally they're called 55 plus communities. So the main distinguishing characteristic between that and independent living is that there's no meals in 55 plus communities. Now, just a quick thing I want to talk about for a second is what's happened with COVID and long-term care communities. COVID was terrible for the long-term care communities. In the first couple of waves of COVID, the people in long-term care communities suffered the most. For a while there, over 60% of deaths that happened in the United States happened in nursing homes and other long-term care communities. That was in the first 2 waves of COVID. For the first 6 months, basically from April of 2020 up to about September 2020, all long-term care facilities were locked down. Nobody from outside could come visit, and nobody from inside could leave without having to do a 14-day isolation quarantine when they came back to the building. So for the first 6 months of the pandemic, it was terrible. Nobody was moving into these places because who wants to drop off their parent when they didn't know if they'd ever be able to see him again? Who want to drop their parent off at one of these places where these were where the huge infections were going on. So during the previous waves, it was terrible. Starting about September last year in assisted living and memory care and independent living, they opened it up so that initially somebody could go visit their parent in only one room in the community with an appointment. Then about a month later, they opened it up so that there were 2 essential caregivers who were allowed to go in the building, but they were only allowed to go in the building and visit their loved one in their loved one's apartment. And they had to make an appointment because they didn't want too many people coming in from the outside. That lasted from about October up until March of this year. And then March of this year, things started opening up much more because the vaccines were so successful. So if let's look at this slide that I have here on the screen. Right? No, that didn't work. So on the left-hand side is the number of people. This is in Austin, Travis County. This is the number of people from long-term care facilities that had cases of COVID. On the left-hand side, it's residents of long-term care facilities. That's the one in green. On the right-hand side in purple, that's staff of long-term care facilities. So what you need to understand about this chart is there's basically been 4 waves of COVID in long-term care facilities. The first wave, and it's really hard to see, but that it says April 2020. The first wave was the initial wave in long-term care facilities. The second wave was last summer, because remember last summer we had a lot more cases in Texas than they had the rest of the country. The third wave is basically last November, December, and January. It peaked in January, and then fell off rapidly as people got vaccinated. And the fourth wave is the wave that's going on currently. That's on the far right-hand side. Now, if you looked at these statistics nationwide, the first, second, and third waves, the first wave was much lower. The second wave was over twice as high, and the third wave was over twice as high as the second wave. In the long-term care facilities, the waves were much more severe all along. And we were averaging, so for example, in January of 2020, we averaged about 22 new cases in long-term care facilities per day. Then once people ended up getting the vaccination, the cases dropped off rapidly. And by May, there was only 5 cases, by March, there were only 5 cases in all of March in long-term care facilities, whereas there was over 400 cases in January. And then, as you can see in the chart here, we went along for a couple of months and until the current bump, which is what I'm calling the fourth wave. These days, most days, I think we're averaging about 3 new cases a day in long-term care facilities throughout Austin, Travis County. So we're seeing very few cases, and of the cases are generally mild. So what I'm going to tell you is that anecdotally, when there is an outbreak in a long-term care facility, most of the time the symptoms are very mild and very few people are having to go to the hospital. I know one person who's died in a long-term care facility in this last month and a half, the last wave that's been happening because of the Delta variant. That person was on oxygen before they got COVID. So they were sort of low-hanging fruit for COVID to sort of take out. I consider these statistics to be very hopeful, and where I would expect us to be going on long-term care going forward is we'll probably continue to not have very severe restrictions about visiting our parents. We may have, another month or two where people they're taking more extreme precautions. They may return to some more extreme precautions than they have now. But I think what we're going to be doing going forward is we're going to be managing COVID as a long-term and endemic disease, just like we manage flu season and things like that. I think that's where we're headed. But during the previous waves, it was terrible. People were locked down. They were taking all their meals in their room. We were going to keep them safe, even if it killed them. And realistically, the isolation was terrible for the seniors. That eased up, as I say, at about September, October timeframe. And it really got good starting around March, about a year after the beginning of the pandemic. We seemed like things were over. We're in a fourth wave right now. It's not very bad. And hopefully we don't lock down or have other problems. But that's just what I want you to take away from where we're headed for in long-term care because of COVID. With that, I'm going to open it on up for questions. I've been talking about an hour, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions, and I'm sorry for the length of my discussion. I hope that information has all been helpful.
Michael, thank you so much. Yes, a lot of fantastic information and a lot to try to digest. Obviously, it's the conversation around long-term care is not something that's really simple, that one size fits all. And there's a lot of options in the community. Going back to when you were talking about the continuing care retirement community, got a question. Can you explain what a buy-in is?
So in a continuing care buy-in, what ends up happening is, so if you go to Westminster, you put down $400,000 for a one-bedroom apartment. The community will basically take that $400,000 and they will give 90% of that back to you or your heirs when you leave. While they're holding that 90%, they're basically using that 90% to pay down their mortgage. As such, what they're doing is they're giving you a lower rate on your community, on your apartment. So in a one-bedroom apartment, you may have to pay, say, $3,500 monthly fee in a one-bedroom apartment at Westminster or Quincy or one of these other places. And I'm characterizing the number, don't hold me to the number, but it's about right. Now, if you went to a similar quality place like Marvia or Triangle, that would be a $5,500 per month apartment. Okay, so you got about a $2,000 savings because of the buy-in. That's number one. Number two, that's for an independent living apartment. Now, in 5 or 10 years, when somebody has to move to the next level of care, whether that be assisted living or memory care or skilled nursing, that price doesn't go up, but by a little bit. It goes up by a little bit because you go from 2 meals a day to 3 meals a day. But so now you're paying maybe $3,800 a month for assisted living. Well, if you were at one of the other communities, that price for assisted living might be $3,000 more than what you're paying at a comparable facility. So in a sense, what they're doing with the 10% they're not giving you back, they're basically buying a long-term care policy on you. And that long-term care policy more or less pays the difference when you need the higher level of care down the road. So their model means that you have to go in as an independent living resident. Your time there has to season a bit before you get to the higher level of care. And then when you get the higher level of care, they're not really charging that much extra. So that's why you only get 90% of your money back when you end up moving out or dying or whatever.
Got it.
That's kind of quick and dirty. I'm sorry. It gets a lot. There's a lot of nuances, but so few people are going to be able to afford it. And it's such a small part of the industry. I don't want to go into too much time on it.
Sure, but that helps kind of explain what the term means. You know, we've talked a lot about different pricing for here in Central Texas. How do the prices here in Central Texas compare to, say, other parts of Texas? Are we higher here than other parts of the state, or is it pretty comparable across the board?
It's pretty comparable. They're going to be cheaper in both Houston and San Antonio. Dallas seems to be a little bit cheaper too, but a little bit more than the other two places. You know, the other cities are a little bit easier to build communities, particularly in Travis County. It's harder to build a large community, and they're a little bit easier, and there's more space in Dallas and Houston to build these places, and they're a little bit easier on their permitting, it seems. And so there is more competition. There was one year about 5 years ago where so much new assisted living opened up in San Antonio that they increased by 1/3 the number of beds in town in just 1 year. So, you know, that's what drives a lot of things, is just, you know, supply and demand. Here in Austin, for example, it's a lot cheaper for memory care up in Cedar Park because they overbuilt that area as compared to South Austin, which is part of Travis County. Cedar Park's up in Williamson County, and Williamson County is the second fastest growing county in the country. And so everybody wants to be in Williamson County, so they overbuilt it by mistake.
Gotcha. Got a question here. The reason I asked that is because we've got some folks who are joining us from other parts of the state, even from out of state. We have a care partner who's joining us from California. Her husband has Lewy body dementia. And she says that her husband is eligible for a VA long-term care facility. And they also have an excellent long-term care policy that will cover a facility. How does she decide what might be best for him? Are there any rule of thumbs that she might go by to help her decide what type of community might be best for him?
Lewy body dementia, unfortunately, is one of the worst varieties of dementia. And towards the end of life, that particular variety of dementia takes quite a toll on the body. That is one case where I wouldn't hesitate to put somebody in a memory care and skip the assisted living entirely, because frequently the downward trend can be so rapid. So part of what I try and do with my business is we try and look down the road 6 months, a year, or 2 years, because you can't just place somebody, for their needs today. You have to anticipate what's coming. And I've got a very subjective rule of thumb. If somebody has to move a second time within a 1 year period, I'd rather go to the next level of care. If they can stay where they are for more than a year, hey, great, let's give it a shot. Now that's very subjective, but it's just that the pain of moving a second time is so great that I think it's outweighed. So sometimes you have to give up a little bit of quality of life on the front end to gain quality of life on the back end. And moving twice it often costs you a lot of quality of life.
And just talking in generalities for a family that's starting to look at long-term care for their family member, what should they look at when they start in their search? Should they look at the treatment plan, dietary restrictions, meds, legal documents? What are some of the things that a family needs to start pulling together before they start going down this road of looking at long-term care?
Number one, you absolutely need to have the proper legal documents in place. It gets very bad if there's not a power of attorney in place. Family can find themselves cut out of the decision-making process when the state takes over if somebody becomes incapacitated at an early stage, unexpectedly. Only bad things can happen if you don't have a power of attorney in place. That's number one. Number two, people have to recognize that a power of attorney does not give you power over, it gives you power in the event of their incapacity. So there really isn't any reason for somebody to not have a power of attorney in place, because they're not giving up any rights whatsoever at that point. It's only in the event of their incapacity. People often come to me and say, I have power of attorney so I can do what I want. The answer is no, that's guardianship. And guardianship is a real difficult thing to get, and that's a whole different conversation. But most of the time I tell people just put guardianship out of your mind, because it's so difficult and so expensive. So number one, though, is you need to have the legal documents in place, because only bad things can happen. Number two, you need to pull together, an idea of what the assets are. Most of the time when we're dealing with people and trying to figure out where to place them, we're trying to figure out, you would think that it would go by, okay, what are their care needs, number one, number two, which part of town do we want to be in, number three, what's the money? Well, usually money is more often the number one thing we have to talk about, because if you don't have enough money, that's really what's going to be the limiting factor. Geography comes second, and frequently care needs are the last thing that we end up talking about, though that shouldn't be the way things work. Now, care needs are not really negotiable. If you can't get proper care needs, if somebody is not going to be safe, well, you can't negotiate that. So any place we're going to go, you're going to want to look at care needs. But beyond that, assuming all care needs are going to be the same, what are the differentiators? The number one differentiator in my book is going to be activities. A huge problem in old age is loneliness. A lot of that's exacerbated by dementia. But a big differentiating factor is, are the activities good? are there people that you can become friends with? What I say is often, as I tell people, is you want to look for your tribe. If you have a choice between 5 places and money's not a problem, you want to find places where you're going to find potential friend candidates, members of your tribe, so to speak. So in some cases, that means, people who are more educated and more worldly and traveled a lot more. Other cases, that means that, people who are just good Texans, and that's, they want people who are local that, they've always lived locally, and, they have more in common that way. So to me, intellectual stimulation activities, people like you is more important. To me, a place is a place. It's friends and family that makes a difference. And so if you can find friends in a place, that's huge. Food is often a third thing. To me, that's less important than the intellectual part.
Excellent. Going back to our question from our friends in California, for someone who qualifies for a VA long-term care facility, is it better to go with the VA memory care or with a private? Is there much of a difference between the two?
So in Texas, we only have the VA facilities. One's up in Temple, which, for someone in California doesn't know, that's about, depending where you're coming from, an hour and a quarter north of Austin. And the other one is going to be down outside of San Antonio, which can be an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes away. So that's one thing to consider. Second thing to consider is, I think you said you have long-term care insurance. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, the private facilities, I think, are of higher quality than the veterans facilities. And if you have long-term care insurance, I would use that long-term care insurance money for a private facility, thinking and expecting the quality would be better.
Speaking of long-term care insurance, how does it fit in with the financials of long-term care communities? So
long-term care does not pay the community. Long-term care reimburses you for costs at the community. So that's one thing to think about. Usually the way it works is that, say, somebody may have $100 of long-term care insurance per day. That would be $3,000 a month. Then you would add, say, and I'm going to make up some numbers here, $1,800 of Social Security on top of that. So now you're at $3,000 for long-term care, $1,800 for Social Security. That's $4,800 a month. Then there may be some private pensions of another $500 a month. Then they may have a house worth $300,000 and maybe $150,000 in the bank. So, at that point, we're at about, and I'm going quick with the numbers because this is just the way I think, but you got about $5,300 of current income. You have maybe $500,000 of assets. What you want to do is go through the liquid assets first. And if you're paying, say, just to make the numbers easy, $7,300 a month, and your income is $5,300 a month, that's a $2,000 a month negative cash flow. That means if you're taking $2,000 a month out of savings, that's $24,000 a year out of savings. And if you had $200,000 in the bank and $300,000 in the value of the house, well, gee, you've got 8 years in your liquid assets, which would be mutual funds and bank accounts and things like that. And then after that, you'd be living off the value of your house, and that would give you even more time. That's the way I usually think about it. The long-term care insurance, though, is sort of the basis. Unfortunately, only about 4% of people in assisted living have long-term care insurance.
All right. So if you can get it when you can get it, it's usually a good idea to have it.
Correct.
So got a couple of specific questions here. You had talked about, and can I ask you to stop sharing your screen if you don't mind? Thanks so much. That way everybody can see us. Got a question here about someone who their family member is in their early mid stages of dementia. And there's still quite a bit that they can do for themselves. Wondering if independent living is still appropriate for them. The question is, how much do the admissions folks try to screen out someone who has any type of dementia?
I would say there are 15 to 25% of the people in any given independent living have some degree of cognitive decline. I have seen people in independent living who wander outside of their apartments, asking if you can help them find where they need to go. That's clearly too late. But what you have to remember is that people who get there early enough that they can create the memory pathways to stay there, they can stay there safely. If they're going there in sort of early to mid stages, you may find out that their dementia is worse and that they're not able to live alone. And the reason I say that is usually what ends up happening is that when people are living at home, they may have lived there, probably lived there, 5 years to 25 years or something. And so they know where things are. Going to the bathroom is second nature. But if you took them to your house, I had some people who took their loved one to their house during the freeze, and every time her mother came, every time she had to go to the bathroom, she had to ask where the bathroom was. Her memory pathway wasn't there to support her. And her logical reasoning didn't say, oh, well, that's bathroom's probably down where the bedrooms are. I'll just head that direction and look. So, independent living, if you're moving with a fair amount of dementia, it's a big risk because, they're usually a little bit worse than you realize. Having said that, there are plenty of people who live there. And the third thing to remember is, as I said earlier, if you don't think they're going to be able to live there very long, it's probably better to move them to the next level because moving them twice is just going to be very upsetting.
Right, yeah, it'd be very confusing for the person. On those same lines, had a question from a care partner that still living with the husband, they're living alone, looking at long-term care options for the two of them together. Is there an opportunity in the area where someone who has dementia can move into long-term care with their care partner who does not, where they could live together?
Yes, that is certainly possible. There are a dozen different places where you have independent living, assisted living, and memory care attached. The problem that you're going to have when you move into independent living in a care facility is you as the spouse are still going to end up being the caregiver. Even if you move to assisted living, and we're counting on the assisted living doing a lot of the caregiving activities because you're living with them, it just functionally, it's going to end up still being a very different, very difficult experience to change your caregiving role because of past habits and stuff like that. So if you're being overwhelmed at home, living with somebody, even in assisted living, is probably going to be overwhelming as well. The bad news there is that sometimes separating is necessary. That's not what the goal is, of course, and that feels cruel to somebody that you're separating from. Sometimes it's necessary. One issue that I have, and I tell people, and particularly I have to have this discussion with the adult children, is, when your one parent got sick, everybody leapt to try and support that sick person and take care of him at home. At some point, that sick person, frequently we're talking about dementia, has progressed so far and that dementia is having really difficult effects on the healthy caregiver. And sometimes the kid's responsibility has to shift from supporting the unhealthy one to supporting the healthy caregiver because they still have vibrancy and life left. And you don't want the dementia to kill two people instead of one. So these are really difficult balancing acts. It's really good to move into a community where you could be in independent living and you can visit your husband or wife in memory care every day just by walking down the hall and around the corner. But you're able to sort of leave and leave the caregiving duties behind. Caregiving can take 10 years off of somebody's life. And so that's one of the reasons why AGE and people like this have caregiver conferences, is to support you. And this is one of the times when it's really difficult to figure out the best way to do it. But what I would do would be take somebody on over, take a look at places and do the exploration at least. You should go look at some communities to try and wrap your mind around what's possible.
Got it. Going back to your description of the difference between assisted living and skilled nursing communities, is the main difference between the two the 13-minute exiting rule? This particular person, mom is blind, has Alzheimer's, and is wheelchair bound. and would need assistance. So is skilled nursing the primary way that they should be going?
No, so misunderstood a little bit. There's type A and type B assisted living. In type A assisted living, everybody has to be able to self-evacuate within 13 minutes, and clearly your mother couldn't. In a type B assisted living, they have to have enough staff to evacuate everybody within 13 minutes. Memory care is always a type B assisted living. In your type of case, many memory cares could take care of her. I don't think assisted living would be appropriate, but a memory care is a type B. They could take care of her. They could evacuate her within enough time frame. She does not have to go to skilled nursing. A skilled nursing could certainly handle her needs. However, it would probably come down to money more than it would to her care needs.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification. Talk about it here specifically in Austin. Are there any communities that could accommodate a person who does not speak English or Spanish as their primary language? Are there communities that can take some of our loved ones who are use other language?
There is no specialized places for people who speak different languages. I've seen this question come about with people who only speak Japanese or only, shoot, even Italian or some Indian subcontinent languages. There's no place that specializes in that, and that is a problem. No place is going to have a translator for other languages. Spanish is fairly frequent. Beyond that, no, they're going to be able to meet their activities of daily living. They will not be able to meet them intellectually in a halfway place. That's very sad to report.
Okay. Talking about the future of where we are currently here in the Central Texas area, I know that every year you do a great presentation that talks about what we see coming on the horizon as terms of new facilities that are being built. You mentioned how that there was a lot of growth that happened up in the Cedar Park Leander area because that's where land was cheap and there's where was availability, and it got overbuilt. For the next couple of 3 years, what do you see on the horizon for the Central Texas area?
There's still going to be more built. We have better visibility for next year than we do 2 years out and 3 years out, as you'd expect. I guess the main takeaway that I would have is that there's more and more communities being built that have independent living, assisted living, and memory care on the same campus. It used to be that assisted livings and memory cares were being built and independent living were being built, and now they're being more combined more frequently. That's the main thing I am seeing. There's also a lot of larger nationwide corporations coming into town, more than there has been in the past.
And are you seeing more of the new construction being planned for the more outlying areas in the actual core of the Austin area?
Generally, yes. The only thing that really opened up in the core in in the last 20 years, practically, is the Triangle, which was state land that was opened up. The domain is as close in as most things have been happening. Everything really is happening on the periphery. In the central core of Austin, and I call the central core of Austin, and from the 183 to the north down to 290 to the south, that land is all full and it's too expensive.
We see some of the facilities like Westminster is adding a new wing, a new section, but most of what we have seen with Age of Central Texas is a lot of the new ones are happening further and further out because, one, that's where land is available, that's affordable. And of course, this is a business. And so the goal of the communities is to make money. So they're looking at places they can afford to actually build.
And Westminster was only able to afford because they took a parking lot and expanded it and added underground parking. And that's the only way they could make it work.
Got it. Yeah. Land, we're starting to get really landlocked here in our city. We're talking about the costs that are involved in long-term care, and it's not cheap by any means. So how does a family start planning toward this? We know it's going to be coming at some point sooner than later. How do we start looking financially at how we're going to make this work?
Darn good question. It's probably a better question for a financial planner, even though I've got a lot of finance background. First off, it sucks to be poor when you're old. So definitely do savings. Second thing is long-term care insurance is more expensive than it's ever been. That's because interest rates are so low. Don't want to get political, but with the Fed keeping rates so low, it is really hurting savers, particularly people on a fixed income. And so the expected return on a long-term care insurance policy is much lower than it used to be. It's still a good idea to buy long-term care if you can afford it. Third thing really comes on down to most recent years. One of the trends I've been seeing is that people there's a lot more people in getting 2-bedroom apartments than ever used to. And I think the reason for that is because housing prices have gone up so much, they're feeling more flush. So I always cringe when somebody says, they were renting, they never bought a house, because that's one of the, I guess what I'm saying is buy a house, buy hard assets. To me, and this is going on my Wall Street financial background, it sure seems like inflation's coming. So it does not pay to be a saver. It pays to be an investor in hard assets. And you really have to be disciplined on how you're saving.
And since every person's journey is different, everybody, their situations are different, talking with a financial advisor, talking with a banker, talking with someone who is in that financial realm is one of your best bets. Always start there. It's long-term care insurance is very expensive. If you don't get it early, it becomes much more expensive the longer that you wait. If you don't qualify for Medicaid, the spin down is just very difficult to try to reach that level. I know that I've seen a lot of folks, when we've talked about this with financial planners, they talk about not necessarily looking at one bucket for where the money's going to come from. But if you take some from here and here and here and here and put together, pretty soon you've got something that you can work with. But again, everybody's situation is going to be different. So talk with a financial planner to help you start planning for that. And as you mentioned, for most of us, it's not going to be the if, it's going to be the when. And so this is something we really need to start thinking about.
Absolutely.
We've got just a couple more minutes left, and I wanted to point out that your company provides your services for free. Can you elaborate on that?
I get paid a commission by wherever somebody ends up moving. I've got contracts with pretty much everybody in town. There's a handful of places that don't pay commission, but I don't worry about that. I still refer people to those places. I figure if I build good karma, it'll come back to me. But so if you end up working with me, what ends up happening, we'll eventually go visit 3 places together. You'll choose whatever place and move in, and they would, 30 days later, send me a commission. I am not, because I work with every place, my point there is to tell you that I'm trying to be as objective as possible. My client is the potential resident, and I'm looking most after their comfort and security and appropriate placement as I can. I do not worry about where they go. I do not worry about who pays me more or less or whatever.
And I think it's important to point out that, Michael, you were a caregiver for your mother as well, and that you're coming at it from both sides, from the looking at what is going to be best for the person who is moving in, but also what's going to be best for the family. And this is really a juggling act. You want some place that's going to be great for mom, dad, husband, and wife, but the reality is we've got to be able to afford it. And we don't want to place our loved one somewhere that we're going to have to move them in a couple of years because we ran out of money.
And we don't want to place somebody now and spend so much money that we can't afford to take care of their spouse. We have to look at this holistically. And one thing I will say also, as caregivers, no matter how much you do for your loved one, you're always going to feel guilty that you didn't do more or better. And I'll tell you that from a personal perspective of having been a caregiver for my mother, who was in memory care for 4.5 years. And I still feel guilty that maybe I should have kept her home longer or something or whatever. it's a universal issue that people have to confront. It's not a good time of life. It's difficult, and you have to just do your best.
And Michael, we thank you so very much for everything that you do, because like we said at the beginning, you're one of the top experts in this field, and we really appreciate you sharing all of this information. Some of it's hard to digest, some of it's hard to hear, but you know, it's the reality of where we are as caregivers. And I appreciate you taking the time out today, helping us try to figure this out, because it is very difficult. You know, a lot of us grew up only knowing the term nursing home, and there's so much more that's available to us. In many ways, that's fantastic, but on the flip side, it can be much more confusing for us as caregivers who are not living in this 24/7 as our daily job. So we appreciate having folks like you who are available to share that knowledge, that expertise, and kind of help guide us through this part of the journey. So we appreciate you very, very much taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for your expert facilitation.
Thanks so much. And we thank you at home for joining us again today. We hope this has been very helpful for you. We'll be back again tomorrow. We've got 2 more sessions for our 20th anniversary of the Striking a Balance Conference. Tomorrow morning, we're going to have a roundtable with caregivers, and we're going to talk through things that we have learned in this journey. And then tomorrow afternoon, Bob Stephen from AARP, he's the vice president at AARP, is going to join us. We're going to talk about what do we see on the horizon for caregiving. COVID has kind of threw us for a loop, but it also opened some doors for us. So what's coming for us next? We thank you again for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we will see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.